Hi everybody, my name is Bernard. I'm originally from Austria. This autumn, my wife and I, we're going to move to England, where I'm going to be studying theology for 3 years. And because I'm going to study theology, I was invited to preach at the Sunday service. This is actually the first time that I'm preaching. Hope it's going to go well. It's good that we prayed, so I think we should be fine. Now, many of you already know me, because I've been in this church for about 8 years, but some of you might not know me, so I'll introduce myself shortly. As I mentioned, I'm originally from Austria. I studied in England and Spain business when I was finishing my degree in Spain. I had a girlfriend from Finland, so that's why I decided to move to Finland. In 2003, when I started working here, a couple of months later, she went to Mexico for a year. A couple of months later, we had to break up, and I was really devastated. I thought, okay, why did I come here? And I was kind of also asking God, like, what was the plan here then? But fortunately, I came across this book called The Purpose-Driven Life, and in that book, the author promises that this book will help you to discover why you're alive and God's amazing plan for you. And I thought, that's great. That's exactly what I would like to know. And it turns out I discovered just that. I just discovered that there are certain purposes that God has that are universal and eternal. And if you can build your life around those purposes, then it doesn't really matter so much where you are or what's happening to you. And if I were to ask you, what does God want from you, what would come to your mind? Well, when it comes to listening to God's Word, there's another, like God speaking to you, to your heart. There's another good book that I can recommend that's called Experiencing God. But on a more general level, you can be sure that there are certain things that God always wants from you. He wants you to love Him. He wants you to love your neighbor. And He wants you to become more like Him, to grow in His likeness. And to love your neighbor, it can be expressed in different ways. It can be expressed in going through life together, sharing life together. It can be expressed in serving one another. And it can also be expressed in sharing the good news with one another. Last week at the annual general meeting, we defined our vision statement. We decided on a new vision statement for our church. And it reads, glorifying God by knowing Jesus, growing together, living God's love, and making disciples in Jesus. And actually in that vision statement you have kind of the similar elements. You have worship, loving God, you have loving your neighbor, you have discipleship, becoming more like Jesus. But notice that from those things, many of them can actually be done in eternity also. You can worship God in eternity, you can spend time together in eternity, you can become more like Jesus in eternity, you can serve one another in eternity, probably. But there's one thing we can't do in eternity, and that is to share the good news with other people. Because in heaven, everybody knows the good news. Alright? So that's why evangelism should have a special place in our hearts. And that's why today, what I'd like to do is look at what the New Testament reading tells us about evangelism in the early church. Now, because I'm studying theology, or let's say I'm going to study theology, I started looking into Greek because, if you want to study theology, you have to learn Greek because the New Testament was written in Greek. I used to be more optimistic about learning languages. That was before I started learning Finnish. I've been living in Finland for 8 years. I'm still trying to learn Finnish. It seems still Greek to me, most of it. So maybe learning Greek would help me now to finally get a grasp on Finnish. And so I decided to start early, and I downloaded. Nowadays you can download classes from the internet for free. So one of the first things I learned is that Greek was actually known as the common language from around 330 BC to around 330 AD. Does anybody know why it was exactly around in the 330s before Christ that Greek became so widely spoken? Any ideas? Yeah.
Alexander the Great.
Exactly, Alexander the Great. And why do we know that he's great? Well, because at the age of 20, at the tender age of 20, he inherited his father's kingdom. His father was king, he died all of a sudden. He inherited a great army, probably the best trained army of that time, and he promptly decided to take over the world. And by the age of 32, when he died, also rather abruptly, he had conquered all of the known world at that time, from Greek, the Middle East, Egypt, Persia, even as far as India. He conquered those countries. Because of him, for 600 years, people spoke Greek in all those countries. And the fact that I have to learn Greek nowadays is because Alexander the Great conquered all those nations. So you can see a big impact of that. And it made me think, actually, that's how the nations of this world work. That's how kingdoms of this world work. If you think of other languages, the same applies. Why do people speak Arabic in most of the Middle East and North Africa? Well, it's because when Islam came to power, they conquered all those countries and spread their language that way. The same goes for Spanish and Central and South America, for French in many parts of the world, and also for English. English was spread by colonization. And our church is also evidence of that we still speak a language here in Finland, even though it's not the national language. And maybe also the fact that I don't speak Finnish yet is evidence that English is pretty widely spoken. Now, if this is how the kingdoms of this world are built, how does that compare to the church? Well, you could say that this probably happened as well, that we spread the values of the church by force. The Crusades would be an example, or colonization to some degree. But on the other hand, having used force is not a legacy that the church is proud of. In fact, it is something that the church has been criticized for a lot, and something that we're rather ashamed of. And moreover, we should ask ourselves, what did Jesus actually teach? Because that defines what the church should be doing. And when Jesus was asked by Pilate in John 18, "Are you the king of the Jews?" he replied in verse 36, "My kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would have been fighting that I would not be delivered over to the Jews. But my kingdom is not of this world." So there's a very clear distinction between the kingdom of this world, where force is used, and the kingdom of his, where force is absent. And you can also see that in how the early church went about evangelism. If you look at the Bible reading of today, the New Testament's Bible reading, we've read through Acts 17, verses 1 to 15. Now, I'll summarize quickly for you what has been going on. They arrive in Thessalonica. Paul goes to the synagogue. He reasons from the scriptures. He shows how Jesus was prophesied about, like all the things that happened in his life were prophesied about in the Old Testament. He preaches a short message, or the message that we have in the reading is, "This Jesus I'm proclaiming to you is Christ." Some are persuaded, some are not persuaded. Those who are not persuaded, as you can read in verse 5, rounded up some bad characters from the marketplace, formed a mob, and started a riot in the city. They are brought before the authorities, and having paid a security, so it's probably like a down payment, probably Jason had to pay that, so as a guarantee that they would leave the city. Then they leave the city and they escape to Berea. And in Berea, a similar situation unfolds. Paul goes to the synagogue, he reasons with the audience. Some believe, some don't believe. Those who don't believe in Thessalonica, they catch up with him, and he has to escape to Athens. And in Athens, Paul goes and preaches and reasons about Jesus. So there seems to be a bit of a pattern here. Go to a new place, explain the gospel. Some people will be persuaded, some people will not be persuaded. Opposition arises, flee to the next town, and start over. And if you look back in chapter 16, just before chapter 17, the same thing happened in Philippi. They went to Philippi, but they proclaimed the gospel. Some people believed, some didn't, and they had to escape to Thessalonica. But this pattern actually already started earlier. If you read you probably remember that Stephen was the first martyr. In Acts 7 we read about how he was martyred for his faith. And in chapter 8 we read, "And there arose on that day a great persecution against the church in Jerusalem, and they were all scattered throughout the regions of Judea and Samaria, except the apostles."